Hello everyone. Let's after going over Mexico's case, we won't go much in detail as we did in Mexico's case because first thing, these lectures were meant to be supplemental, and also because Mexican case is a model for you to tie colonial past, to see colonial ties uh, to the way society developed over time. So Nigeria's case will we will go a little fast, and also the readings from Bora in Mexican case, which had somewhat general ideas, holds true for Nigeria or any other colonized country. So having said that, but then Nigeria is also meant to be an example of colonization that occurred not just in the uh, western region of Africa, but also the entire Africa. So having said that, let's say the pre-1900 Nigeria. In terms of politically, much of Africa is in general acephalous, which means the word sep means head, so acephalous means without head. So instead of, even though there were parts of Africa which had kings like Ethiopia and some of the kings in southern Africa, much part of general larger part of Africa was based on smaller community, loosely tied to held together by kinship ties or local ties like tribe or family. So it was those groups which was existing. There was not a one. There was not a political leadership or um, one head until colonization occurred in sub-Saharan Africa. Um, so you see those acephalous nature of communities existing in the Nigerian region before colonization. Then we see Nigeria has been target of two empires. Of course, uh, both these empires turned their attention towards Nigeria rather recently, say for last 200 years. Well, the 200 years is still a large lot of years, but in terms of colonization or in terms of compared to Mexican colonial history, it's pretty recent in terms how these two empires targeted Nigeria. So the first one of those empires is Fulani Empire, uh, which was part of Sokoto Caliphate. Uh, what that meant is local leaders and especially the northern regions of Nigeria have been loyal to Sultan and answer to Caliphate. And mm, what it meant is basically a religious movement led by Arabs from North Africa and also from Arabian Peninsula, bringing religion into Northern Africa and also the current region of Northern Africa. But this did not last long because by 1860s, British had established their rule and colonized large part of Africa along with other European countries, cutting up the African continent into their own colonial empires. So the nature of British rule is less of colonization than in the case of Mexico, because there were very few British who came into Nigeria to settle. It was more of British wanting to explore and exploit natural resources that were in abundance in Nigeria, um, um, for the larger British Empire. I mentioned this aspect in the Monday's class also. You see, the colonization coincided with the Industrial Revolution that was happening in in the case of uh, Western Europe in general, but more specifically in the case of UK. And we have seen that in the nation formation case, in the UK's case, how the Industrial Revolution triggered this entrepreneurial class who came up with a new innovation, new technology, and then the next thing you see is they're all resource hungry, and that has triggered even the empires or the kings or the rulers to um, look for resources across the world. And the next thing we see is this process of colonization which is setting. And we see that in the case of Nigeria too. It appears Britishers were there in Nigeria not necessarily to settle in, but to exploit the natural resources uh, in, that are available in abundance in Nigeria. So they allowed the local leaders to have a lot of control. It was more of an indirect rule. So they allowed the local leaders to have a lot of control. That meant your leader was not some British person, but a local chieftain who was given a lot of freedom to rule, um, that they had done previously, provided that raw materials continue to roll towards the port and from port to England, and from port to England. So So to do this, British used the tactic which most of the colonial empires have done, is to play the tribes against one another, and it was famously this tactics was famously called divide and rule policy, which British as a colonial master seems to have applied wherever they went. So you can see that even in the case of Indian subcontinent, where they pitted one king against the other, so that they can continue to rule. Since there was no central authority, in the case of Nigeria, they played one tribe against the another. Since there was no central authority, British always favored one tribe over the other, so that they cannot become one and rise up against the British Empire. Mm, although this tactic was not always used by British and other European powers, it was also used by local tribes who wanted the colonial rulers to do their dirty job. There is always conflict between the tribes. One tribe is more access to resources and they are more richer, and then the next thing you see is the other tribe siding with the British and British troops going over and confiscating the opposite tribe. So it's also the point here is the tribes also were very easily uh, succumbing to those tactics because they were also not able to cooperate with other tribes, and they are always in conflict with other tribes. So the result of this is first you see mm, Islamic Empire coming from north, and then British coming from south through port, uh, was that Nigeria developed a strongly regional ethnic identity with many different communities, but in the large sense, three main ethnic communities in terms of language and culture um, have come into existence in Nigeria. You have uh, Hausa in north, which were predominantly Islamic, and their beliefs are Islamic beliefs. And then you have Igbo in south, which are largely comprised of converted Christians by British. And then you have Yoruba in West, who are animist, who are more believers of nature, and they're not any specific to one deity. So let's look at the map of Nigeria and how this territory is consisted of these ethnicities. So you see in the northern territory, you have more than half the territory. You have a Hausa tribe, and most of them are Muslims. And then you see on the west Yoruba, and on the south Igbo. So even though more than half of the population and territory is Muslim majority, you can still see there are other ethnic communities competing within Nigeria. So we cannot say it's a uh, Islamic society, because you also see other communities competing in the Nigerian society. So we see these three main ethnicity uh, competing among themselves within the Nigerian society. So let's go over modern Nigerian history. So what happened in the 1960s, post World War II? This Under the strain of Second World War, the British Empire was started to crumble. There are many historians who say it started with the independence of India in 1947, which was considered to be crown jewel of British Empire. Um, but again, it's the historians who say. But there are some history which refer to that main event as triggering the independence of many countries. But anyway, even in African context, British started to pulling out of various African countries in 1960s, and the next thing we see is Nigeria also getting independence in 1960. When the British left, they left a parliamentary system which they themselves had, with strong prime minister and very strong regionalized political organization. In a sense, there were three regions, three larger regions into which Nigeria was developed. So Nigerians were happy. They were happy, but you have to do once the colonial leaders have left, you are on your own self. So Nigerians unfortunately devolved into a system where there were a lot of corruption at the leadership level. This came to an end with 1966 military coup, which lasted until 1979. So just after 6 years of independence, Nigeria went into dictatorship, and it lasted until 1979.